Americans are experiencing firsthand the impact of hyper-partisan politics, and yet such divides across the political sphere are not limited to just the United States. France's President Emmanuel Macron, describing his political landscape, says, "The old division of politics into right and left no longer applies. Now it is openness versus nationalism, and nationalism means war." Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And today we have with us author, journalist, William Drozdiak. He's the author of a new book, The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. But before I bring Bill into the conversation, let me thank especially our Global Forum members. That's a special level of membership, and it's really been making such a difference here at the World Affairs Council, as we've been, in part, as you well know, locked down for now over 8 months. And another thing that's helped so much is the sponsors who have supported programs like today's. Maisie Heiken, I always see your name here as one of the program sponsors. We're so grateful. And if others would like to support our programs, you can do so by contacting me or Alana Buenrostro at the World Affairs Council. And we ask that you make a contribution of $500 or $1,000. Want to also recognize Lucy and Henry Billingsley. The Billingsley Company is the Global Forum patron, and they make it possible for us to bring to you so many different programs. And I know while we've not had programs in person, we'll make it up to you as soon as possible. And again, thanks for renewing your memberships. Want to thank our good friends over at the SMU Tower Center at Southern Methodist University for being a promotional partner as well. And as always, please do support your local independent bookstore. You know, it was just a few days ago, and I don't remember whether it was in the New York Times or the Washington Post, I read a story about how independent bookstores are really struggling. And so do make that special effort to support the store in your neighborhood. You can go to interabangbooks.com and purchase The Last President of Europe, or any books that you put in your shopping cart will be eligible for a 10% discount. All you have to do is type in the code dfwworld. But let me remind you, that's only for online purchases. As always, please do go, if you've missed a program or you'd like to share one of our programs, go to YouTube and go to our channel at DFW World. So let me bring Bill into the conversation, but before I do so, let me just tell you a little bit about him. He's a senior advisor for Europe with McClarty Associates, and he serves as well as a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Foreign correspondent with really decades of experience and thousands, no doubt maybe a few million frequent flyer miles. Bill spent much of his career with Time Magazine as well as the Washington Post, where he was the senior editor and foreign correspondent. Bill, I've got to say, I'm sort of glad that we're not standing next to each other, because I know you are 6 feet 5 inches. Our members know well that I'm about a foot shorter than that. And of course, you played professional basketball for 7 years in the United States and in Belgium. So it's great to have you with us. Let's bring you into the conversation.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in Dallas, and I look forward to a stimulating discussion.
You know, one of the things that strikes me before we talk about your book is you've been a journalist for a number of decades, and it sure has changed. When you were at the Post, at the beginning of your career, and when you left the Post, give us a sense of how many foreign bureaus there were and the investment that newspapers put into foreign coverage.
Well, during the 1990s, right into the early new century, newspapers were thriving. The Washington Post had about 26 foreign bureaus around the world. And then when the advertising drought hit, and that was when classified ads, which were the main source of income for newspapers, plummeted, then the publishers tried to make savings, and the first place they looked was to cut the number of foreign bureaus, which I think is as a tragedy for American readers because we became less and less informed about the world outside. And now with the rise of social media, it's and YouTube and other methods of learning about the world outside, we're getting more information, but a lot of it is slanted and biased. And the great thing about strong newspapers like the Washington Post and others in those days was that we had a profitable business, but we also had leadership at the top. My editor-in-chief, Ben Bradley, is quite a legend. And the Graham family, which owned the paper, were determined to put out first-class journalism, and they would not tolerate the kind of slanted, biased reporting that we often see now, which is largely a result of the rise of social media.
We have often a lot of students who are watching and participating in our programs. What would you advise them now if they were interested in a career in journalism? Do you recommend getting a bachelor's degree in journalism, or do you recommend something else and then getting work experience and going to graduate school? What are your thoughts there?
I've always thought the best way to use your time in college was to study a discipline, whether it be history, economics, and then apply that to and build up your writing skills. I think what I studied economics and politics at the University of Oregon and later on in graduate school, and it served me well in drawing on that knowledge when I went out into the world as a foreign correspondent to cover different stories. Because really you can learn the fundamentals of writing well and writing good, solid newspaper story with a strong narrative in 3 months or so. And if you can't learn it that quickly, then maybe you ought to find another profession.
You know, I should mention that we've had a lot of columnists from the newspaper, The Economist, and that's really their strategy. They'll hire someone who has a degree in archaeology or biochemistry. They feel we know that they're smart, they can study, they can learn quickly, and then they can teach them how to write as a reporter for The Economist.
That's right. It's all about telling a good story and making sure you get the facts straight and inform people above all.
Let's turn to your book. It was really quite interesting just how much access you had to Emmanuel Macron. Did you have a relationship or friendship with him before he became president?
No, we actually got to know each other through mutual acquaintances, particularly the French ambassador to the UN, Francois Delattre, who's now a senior figure back at the Foreign Ministry, put me in touch with him. And he was familiar, it turned out, with my work. I had been Paris bureau chief for the Washington Post in the 1990s. And those days, my writing appeared in the International Herald Tribune, which was followed very closely by the French political class. So those 6 years in Paris served me well. I learned French fluently, and I was able to conduct our conversations in French, which is something that President Macron appreciated, even though he speaks fairly decent English, but having a leader, a figure of his stature, to express himself in his native tongue was important, because his mind is so nimble, and he's got a lot of interesting thoughts, and it was important to have him express himself in his own language.
Take a minute or two, Bill, and tell us where he came from, because he really does have quite an elite education and background, especially when you think about the French system, which puts so much weight on where you go to school.
Right. Well, there was nothing that really foreshadowed him becoming president of France. I mean, he was raised in a middle-class household, the son of 2 doctors, mother and father, in the northern industrial town of Amiens. And his education, first in Amiens, then later at elite schools in Paris, were a classical road to getting involved in the ruling establishment. But where he really broke ground was this daring move to create his own party. And he saw the emptiness of the old ideologies of that, going from left wing to right wing governments in France. And he said all of these old tired definitions don't apply to the world today. So he really created a party that was designed to select what would be the best policy prescriptions for France. And France has lagged behind badly over the last couple of decades. And he made a strong pitch, particularly to young people and others who wanted to see France really shaken up and brought into the 21st century. And that's what he's tried to do, but of course, not without a lot of resistance, because France in particular, being an old country, is stubbornly allergic to change.
When in his last election, the presidential election, there was a runoff. He won by how much?
In the runoff against Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far right National Front Party, he won 66% of the vote against her 34%. So it was a pretty substantial victory, but nonetheless, she has quite a strong base in on the right wing, and I predict that the next the elections in 2022 will feature a runoff once again between him and her.
So you wrote, when he entered office in May 2017, he had three major goals: modernize France, relaunch campaign for unified Europe, and establish Europe as a major player in a multipolar world. And in a sense, it reminded me a bit of George W. Bush with what his goals were. And then everything he had hoped to do was completely derailed, detoured by 9/11. And in a sense, Macron's had that same situation with what happened domestically. Discuss with us the whole situation with Gilets jaunes and how that came about.
Right. Well, as you said, Macron got off to a very fast start. He pushed through in the face of a lot of skepticism even from his supporters. Some dramatic and bold reforms of the economy, the pension system, as a way of trying to wean people off of their dependence on the state. In France, when he came into office, 57% of the economy was run by the state. And he said, we need to unleash the entrepreneurial energies of our people, particularly young people, and make them less reliant on handouts from the government. And so this was his main pitch. He wanted to bring back a lot of expatriates, French expatriates who have gone abroad because they were disillusioned with the weak economy in France. And the hope that Macron inspired was quite significant. And sure enough, a lot of young expatriates have come back to France and tried to launch new businesses. But at the same time, and something he did not foresee, nor did any of the commentary class, that there was in the countryside rising resistance to all of this change. And in particular, one of the changes he made was the spark that lit the fire. And that was a notably positive policy that a lot of people had applauded, which was, in order to get to reduce the levels of car pollution, he wanted to encourage people to move from diesel fuel cars toward electric cars. And so they raised the tax just a few pennies on diesel fuel. But for people living in the countryside who own these old automobiles, that because diesel fuel costs less than regular gasoline in France, for them, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, that they were already struggling, many of them making less than $1,000 a month and having to drive themselves to jobs maybe 30 minutes away. And the cost of this fuel was going to be a significant burden. And people who live in the cities, notably in Paris, in France, they didn't see this coming because they benefit from subsidized public transport and don't depend on a car the way people do in the provinces. So this erupted in an unusual way in that a lot of these people in the provinces occupied the roundabouts, the traffic roundabouts, and this continued to grow and grow, and then finally led to protests throughout the city, and they really turned on President Macron in a vicious and violent way. And I would say, you know, he was there was one particular incident when he was chased out of a town that he was visiting to try to calm down the population, and they were saying, our job is to send you to the guillotine. And he retreated in behind the walls of the Élysée Palace and became, I think, rather depressed, and didn't go out into public for 3 weeks, and then finally emerged with a plan to go visit, run a series of town hall meetings around the country.
And before you get to that, Bill, let me just remind our viewers, go ahead and ask questions and we'll work them into the conversation. Talk about, because I want to get to the great national debate, but talk about just the personal toil that what happened and how it affected him. And I think it was so interesting that his advisors, including his wife, Brigitte, said, you know, we really need to sort of take you out of the limelight for a while and have you recover, rest, and just not be this flashpoint out in the public.
Yeah, and I think that's what he did. I think it was in December of 2019. And so for about 3 weeks, retreated behind the walls of the Élysée Palace. But of course, he was frustrated. He couldn't understand why there would be such violent resistance to his policy ideas, which after all were intended to modernize France, to make things better. And subsequent later on, when things had calmed down, I had a conversation with him, which I asked him. I said, "What surprised you the most about this your first 2 years in power?" And he said, "I would say it's the hatred that I sensed in among my compatriots, the angry, violent rejection of my ideas. It's one thing to disagree with my ideas, but to do so with such violent passions is really a sign that politics is becoming polarized, not just in the United States, but in France and all over the world." And he found this to be very threatening to the nature of democracy.
So when he resurfaced, he wrote an open letter. I think that was in early 2019. What was his approach in that letter?
Well, he was trying to explain the rationale behind his reforms. And he said, "I understand the frustrations. Maybe I didn't take them into account as much as I should have." He promised to be more understanding. He had been criticized for having a glacial arrogance, trying to float above the fray, but that's not really his nature. He's a micromanager, sleeps very little, 4 hours a night, wants to get involved in every detail of the policy. So this
is that a negative? Is that a Jimmy Carter syndrome?
Well, in the French system, it is, because in their system, the president is supposed to be above day-to-day politics. The prime minister is the one who runs the day-to-day affairs of government, and traditionally, presidents have used their prime minister as sort of a shield blunt criticism from the public. I mean, Francois Mitterrand was a master at that. He went through 3 or 4 prime ministers because they became extremely unpopular, while he would project the image of a philosopher king thinking great thoughts about the future of the world and not getting his hands soiled by the mudslinging of politics.
You know, well, now I want to ask you about the great national debate, but I couldn't help thinking, and excuse me if to those who may disagree, but that the discussion in France about the politics is at such a higher level than we're experiencing here. And you really see this, how President Macron traveled around France over several weeks.
Well, that's right. He subjected himself to humiliating abuse from the public in these town hall meetings. He attended about 15 or 16 of them around the country in the early part of I guess it was January 2019 and February. So for about 2 to 3 months, he would go out and would participate in these discussions. Some of them would last 6 or 7 hours. He would stay there until well past midnight, as long as people had questions to ask and wanted to offer their comments. And he thought it was important to hear their criticisms and try to rebut them as best as he could. And he did get some grudging support for that from a lot of his opponents. And I thought that this helped him turn around his plunge in the popularity polls at that time.
Where's his popularity now? Where does it stand?
I would say it's probably, again, it's been driven by the pandemic and the related crises with that, but I would say it's close to 40%. And at the low point, it was probably down around 20%.
So let's move to his relationship with some of the key players on the global stage. And of course, he's been called the Trump whisperer at times. Sometimes that's been viewed positively and other times negatively. Tell us some behind the scenes anecdotes about his strategy in meeting with Donald Trump the first time.
Well, it's interesting. All the other European leaders were aghast by Trump's election. And in particular, Angela Merkel, who was seen as the most experienced leader of Europe. And she did not get along at all from the beginning with Trump, said, you know, I can't bear being in the same room with him. And Trump in particular was quite critical of Germany and her leadership because he believed that Germany in particular had taken advantage of the trading relationship with the United States. So Trump became known by others. He said, look, we have to maintain a dialogue, a channel with the leader of the United States because the transatlantic partnership is so important. And so he struck up this rapport, and being more than 30 years younger than Trump, it would seem to be an implausible rapport, but yet they found some common bonds. And he described to me, he said, I saw from the beginning that we shared a similar approach to politics. We were both political mavericks who came out of nowhere, never had held political office before, and both of us destroyed the traditional political establishments in our home countries. And I think this resonated with Trump as well. And plus they had several good meals in Paris with their wives, and Trump came away feeling, oh, this is a really sympathetic young leader, and I get along well with him. And so he was invited to the White House on the very first, as the first state visit of the Trump administration, and spent 3 days with Trump. And that was, they got off to a fairly good start in terms of their own personalities, but politically they clashed repeatedly, whether it was over the climate change accords signed in Paris, over the Iran agreement, with the World Trade Organization.
So let's and I don't know if we have the pictures, but when I think about the two of them together, I have two images. One, that handshake when President Macron tries to get the upper vice-like grip on President Trump, and then the other picture of President Trump picking off a piece of dandruff, which probably did not go over real well. But President Trump and Macron really had a tough discussions on Iran, and Macron felt that he was misled by the president. Isn't that accurate?
Yeah, I think that he felt that he had made an impression with Trump, had made some progress in convincing him of the reasons to stay involved in this agreement, because it was, despite all the criticism that Trump gave, Macron said, look, this is the best process we have going to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and developing it on its own. And so he said, until we come up with a better system, it would be foolhardy to pull out. But Trump, as we have seen, despises the policies that were put into place by the previous administration, no matter how positive they may be, and was determined to reject it out of hand.
What's the state of their relationship now?
I think they have not communicated as frequently as they used to. They used to speak, a couple times every week. But I think right now, with the political campaign in the United States, most leaders have stopped talking to Donald Trump. They did have a good discussion a few months ago when they were, again, Macron was trying to persuade Trump that maybe it would be worth having a conversation with the president of Iran directly, and he tried to set up a meeting at the United Nations with them, which it fell short because the Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, backed out at the last minute because he saw that this could be a dangerous thing for him politically at home.
What would the relationship be with a President Biden?
Well, I think Biden has been a classic transatlanticist all his political career. So I think in Europe, there is great hope that he will return the United States to, its traditional leadership role at the head of the Atlantic Alliance. But others, including Macron, say we're wary about this because we don't think that we can go back to the status quo ante, because the United States was moving away from Europe even before Trump took office. And he's quite firm in his view about that. He saw President Obama's pivot to Asia as a clear sign that Europe was no longer as important for the United States, and that's why he's been very aggressive in his pitch to other European leaders that we need to prepare for the day when the United States will no longer be the guarantor of our security, and we need to have a European defense of our own that we can stand. He calls it strategic autonomy for Europe, and this is one of the central points of his presidency, which has not been shared by Chancellor Merkel or other leaders.
And Bill, were these thoughts not accelerated by President Trump's statements regarding NATO and burden sharing, and just overall how he continued to make statements regarding European countries basically just leaning on the back of the United States?
Yes, no, it certainly did resonate in Europe, and Chancellor Merkel, who was by nature very cautious and very reluctant to cut the cord of solidarity with the United States, said maybe it is time for Europe to take its own destiny into its own hands, but trying to build an independent European defense is going to be extremely difficult. Now, with Britain leaving the European Union, France is the dominant military power on the European continent. But as much as Macron has appealed to Merkel to join him in a concerted effort to build an independent European defense, she's reluctant to do that because that at home in Germany, that's an unpopular view, because Germany has become largely pacifist nation over the last 70 years, partly in response, of course, to the tragedies of World War II, but also because of the nervousness of their neighbors.
I'm glad a few minutes ago you mentioned China, and it seems to me that President Macron is certainly in agreement with President Trump about the threat of China. We have a question from Ms. Kohlenberg. How does President Macron plan to position France and Europe at large in the competition between the United States and China?
Well, Macron's been quite clear in his approach to trade. He's visited China every year since becoming president. He received Xi Jinping in Paris, and each time he has emphasized that, look, if China is going to aspire to be a leading power in the world, it has to play by the rules. And he said there has to be reciprocity. If we are going to open up our economies to China, China has to do so in a similar way to France and other Western countries. But at the same time, he is, I would say, Macron and other European leaders are worried about being dragged along by the United States on a collision course with China. China's their second biggest trading partner after the United States, and they don't want to do anything that would further damage their economies.
Where does France stand on Huawei?
I think they have stood more with the United States than Germany has. I think Macron shares the view that the leap toward 5G technology and making your infrastructure dependent on Huawei would be a dangerous step. And Germany is slowly coming around to that view, as Britain has, after initially saying, oh no, Huawei is the cheapest, most efficient way to do this. Let's go along with it. But now, after the warnings from their intelligence agencies and defense ministries, both France is pulling Britain and Germany along in taking a more skeptical view. What Macron would like to see is a European solution. So he has touted Nokia and Ericsson, from Nokia being from Finland, Ericsson from Sweden, as the companies that should be building the 5G technology for Europe.
Before we talk about some of the recent events in the last week that have taken place that are just so traumatic and atrocious, give us sort of your view now about Macron's overall global perspective and involvement, because he's traveled thousands of miles, been very involved in the Middle East. What's his overall strategy?
Well, I would say he is above all a total pragmatist. He has no illusions that Vladimir Putin is a brutal authoritarian figure, one who assassinates his political opponents. Yet at the same time, Macron says we have no choice but to develop a dialogue with him and try to find channels, areas where we can cooperate, because in areas where our interests are, we have shared interests. And he's taken the same attitude toward China, and also in his dealings with Donald Trump. While Merkel may be allergic to even speaking with Trump, Macron says, no, we have to, he's the leader of the United States. He was elected by the American voters, and we have to deal with him, as repugnant as you may feel about the policies he follows. So I would say, above all, a ruthless pragmatism in his views. He's ready to talk to anybody. And if in order to find a way to reach solutions, because he is a seductor by nature, and he feels if he spends enough time with somebody, he'll be able to convince them to see the wisdom of his ways.
Bill, how involved was Russia, or is Russia now, in hacking and trying to create some of the issues in France that they've been doing here?
Well, from their very first meeting, Macron has made that quite clear to Putin. He wanted to. He knows Putin aspires to be like one of the early czars, Peter the Great. So when he invited Putin to visit France shortly after his election, he pulled out all the stops. They had a festive dinner at Versailles, and so he saw all of this luxurious splendor. But then when they had a press conference, he spoke out immediately. He said, "I know that Russia had tried to interfere with the French election, and we stopped it, and we're determined to do so in the future." And he basically pointed a finger at Putin, right? He said, "We know you were behind this, and we successfully blocked it. And if you try this again, there will be severe consequences."
I suspect that all of our viewers know what happened about a week ago in France when a lycée teacher was beheaded by someone of Chechen heritage, and already over 10 or 11 people have been arrested. What people may not be aware of, though, is that President Macron gave an important speech at the beginning of the month. And so, in a sense, the tensions were rising. And in his speech, he warned the French about the rising threat of Islamist separatism. We only have another 20 minutes, and we could spend another hour talking about this, but this has been such a critical issue on so many levels with France. Tell us about how Macron has had to really have a balancing act on this.
Yeah, well, some of you may recall 2 years before he got elected in 2015, there was this horrible massacre at the Bataclan Theater. More than 130 people were killed. Then there were I think there were others killed at a soccer stadium. And these turned out to be homegrown terrorists. So it was learned that they had gone off to Syria, joined ISIS, and acquired this lust for brutality by fighting with ISIS, and brought it back to France. And so the fear of this homegrown terrorism in the alienated second, third generation of immigrants, immigrant children, is something that really has spread fear in France since those attacks. And France has the largest Muslim population in Europe.
What is the percentage now?
It's officially they say it's about 7 or 8%, but unofficially it's probably closer to 12%, because you have a lot of people who are not counted in the census and all that. And you have these vast stretches of suburban ghettos that are filled with, and mainly where you only hear Arabic spoken. And these are the offspring of immigrants who came in from North Africa. But now we've seen more and more immigrants and large families and with multiple wives coming into France. You just have to take the metro or the train system, and you'll see how many foreigners from the Middle East and North Africa are now living in France. And this is further, he not only politically, this fear is what has fueled the rise of Marine Le Pen and her supporters on the far right, because she says we've got to put a stop to this, mass deportations, block all immigration, and that's her solution, and it's resonating with a segment of the French population. But further down the road, I mean, one of the fascinating aspects about Macron is that he's the most interesting young leader in the world. He's only 42 right now. He was elected at the age of 39, and he thinks into the future. And at one of our last conversations, I said, what do you think the world will look like 30 years from now? And he said, I think the big test will be whether we can succeed in a spectacular transformation of Africa. Because if we fail, the immigration flows that we've seen coming into Europe lately will be nothing compared to what we will see in the future. And he pointed out that millions and millions of people are suffering from drought, shortage of food, and when they have to move, they are desperate and they're going to try to find their way into Europe. And he said, we could be overrun, and Europe, this could be the destruction of Europe.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. And again, let me remind you that we have about another 15 minutes, so please do continue to send questions. This question is, apparently the large migration of Arabs into France has caused a great amount of conflict and unrest for quite some time. Is there any hope of better assimilation in the future? You've touched on this, but I think it'd be helpful to go a bit farther. Is Macron active in proposing policies to help improve the relations? And I would add, Bill, I suspect this is getting harder when you had the situation that happened last week and the fact that he is trying to position himself to run against Marine Le Pen.
Yes, that's right. And his solution is mainly predicated on better education. He said we need to inculcate in these disaffected youths a sense of French values, and we need to open up our educational system so that we get more and more of these young people who can become mainstream. We need to give them, as he said, something to live for rather than something to die for, because many of them who are laid off, can't find work, spend their time going on Twitter or social media and visiting these radicalized Islamist websites. And this was the main recruiting tool for thousands of young French Muslims who went to fight in Syria with the Islamic State. And now they're going down to the Sahel region in Africa, where Islamic State has a strong presence, and fighting for them there. And this is where the French military has been extremely active, trying to block Islamic State from reestablishing itself in the area of Mali and Chad, and trying to topple the governments there. So I think he sees education as the best tool. I asked about, in the United States, we've used affirmative action to try and bring minorities into the mainstream. He said it won't work in France. What we need to do is expand the reach of good education, make classroom sizes smaller, have more teachers. But you mentioned the recent beheading of this teacher. It was driven by the fact that he was trying to teach the values of free speech by showing these pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, which had generated an earlier attack on the French news weekly that had published these pictures. And so it shows that there's still fierce antagonism on the part of a lot of conservative Muslim elements of the population in France, who will not tolerate the sense of division between religion and the state, as prescribed in the French law.
And that truly is a foundation of France, to have this pure separation of state and religion.
That's right. They call it laïcité, which means you are not allowed to show allow your religious views to interfere with the role of state. This led a few years ago to controversy over the wearing of the burqa. This was seen as a manifestation of religious views, and so they banned any wearing of the burqa in schools and public places.
I have a question from Joe. What is the role of France in the negotiations between the EU and the UK over future trade relations? And there's been new news on that in the last week or so as well.
Right. Well, France has been insisting that the EU must stick together, the 27, and taking a very tough stand against Britain on this. Britain has been pleading for special trading arrangements, but the EU, France says, look, we cannot abrogate our own rules to accommodate Britain. They've decided to leave, and so they now have to accept the EU and respect our rules if they're going to have a future trading relationship. And this has really been the core of the conflict, that and the whole question of the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland itself, because Ireland will remain a member, and Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, and trying to sort this out has been fiendishly difficult.
What about COVID-19? I don't have at the top of my head how many people have died in France, but I know it's significant, and there's been a resurgence, and they've just restated some pretty draconian lockdowns, including closing the bars with a curfew at 9 p.m., I think.
Right. Well, France has been hit very hard, probably as bad as any country except maybe Spain and Northern Italy. But they're in this second wave, which has been surging for the last few weeks in France and across Europe. The French are now seeing more cases on a daily basis than even at the previous peak back in April. There are about 30,000 cases a day, announced just yesterday. And so they're expecting their hospitals to be overwhelmed by more, unless they can find a way to put a stop to this. And what they have found is just limiting access to bars and restaurants may not be enough. They may have to shift back to a total lockdown, which has just happened in Ireland. And I think you will see other European countries now moving to a lockdown, where Europe has been, it's been usually a month, 2 to 3 months ahead of the United States in these surges. And a lot of scientists in the United States say that we here in our country are entering a dark phase. Over the next 2 to 3 months could see some of the worst days of the pandemic for us. So we should try to learn from what Europe is experiencing now.
Where does France stand on a vaccine? I mean, traditionally they've always had quite a developed pharmaceutical industry.
Well, they're also, they have drug companies like Sanofi that are trying to develop a vaccine, just as several American companies and Britain as well. But with the rigid testing requirements, they don't expect to have a vaccine ready in France until much later next year.
I hear you have your puppy outside.
Yes, that's right. Beautiful day.
We have a question from Tarek. Most North Africans in France are not Arabs. Many of them have melted and are probably not counted as Muslims. Can you explain to us what is the contribution of many of this third generation North Africans to French society? Not really sure. Did you?
Yeah, well, there have been some success stories, and Macron, in fact, quite a number of them have been had joined Macron's political movement. But what has the attacks in 2015 and subsequent terrorist attacks, it doesn't take much. It could be some isolated cell of terrorists who strike fear across the whole country. So I certainly didn't want to depict the majority of the Muslim population who are peace-loving people and want to integrate more into France as sharing the views of these terrorist movements. But it's difficult when you have the social and economic inequalities in the path toward success in French society. I once asked, Macron went to the École Nationale d'Administration, the ENA, which is kind of a finishing school for the elite of government. And I once interviewed them on the 100th anniversary of the school. I said, well, how many young minority students do you have, Arabs? And he says, oh, we don't have any kind of program to bring them in because it would not be respect our rule of liberté, égalité, fraternité. In other words, everybody has an equal chance. Well, except these people young people grow up in a community where they don't have the same chances, and their schools are not as well equipped, and they don't. And Macron has recognized this, and to his credit, he's partly under the influence of Brigitte. I would say she, being a former teacher, has influenced his views about the importance of education and bringing good quality education to every sector of society as a way of improving the prospects of the underprivileged.
One of the areas where France is a leader in Europe, whether this is good or bad is for others to judge, but that's in arms sales. How is that viewed in the country? And Macron has been quite active traveling and being quite a good arms merchant himself, as has President Trump.
Well, because France has a strong military, it has been building aircraft, tanks of its own over the years. And in order to sustain these industries and make them profitable in the long run, you need to sell abroad. The United States dominates the arms sales abroad in many places, but France has done pretty well. It sold its Rafale fighter jets to India. They've sold their submarines to Australia, and of course to Saudi Arabia as well. So, he sees this as an important contributing factor to France's strength as a commercial power. But there is, of course, resistance. A lot of people say, our country should not be in the business of being merchants of death. And there is particularly a lot of opposition on the left, political left in France. But I would say the majority of the population recognizes that this is the way the world is. If France suddenly stopped selling arms, then the United States, Russia, and others would just fill the void. And if we're going to have a strong military in France, we need to build these weapon systems not just for ourselves, but also to be able to sell them abroad in order to make these industries thrive in the future.
And France, more, I would assume, than any other European country, has a greater footprint in Africa and obviously the Middle East.
Yes, because that's the colonial legacy is strong there in French West Africa, and also in the Middle East, Lebanon, former colonial territory for France, and the Levant stretching into Syria, and even Iraq. When Macron has made 2 trips in the last few months to Lebanon, he's also stopped off in Iraq. And now with the United States pulling out, he sees an opportunity for France to become acquire greater influence.
Let's talk about Lebanon. I mean, after that horrible explosion, which killed so many people in Beirut, destroying the port and the neighborhoods nearby, He visited the site even before the prime minister of Lebanon. Why do you do that?
Well, I think it's, again, his nature. You know, they talk about him in France like the Energizer Bunny. He sees he wants to be actively engaged, and he thinks France needs to be, and Europe indeed should be much more active on the world stage. And so he's trying to set this example, because Europe is usually extremely reticent about making its views known, partly because they need to coordinate the views of 27 countries. But even take Germany, for example, which is often cited as the strongest economic power. Germany usually stands up for its economic interests, but is reluctant. It doesn't have much in the way of military power, and is reluctant to get embroiled in controversies abroad. And Macron believes that Europe needs to change its profile and get actively engaged in places like Lebanon, where Europe might be able to broker a political solution.
So we have a question from Cher Jacobs. Why the title, Last President of Europe?
Well, very good question. I often get asked that. Some people say, you know, this sounds a little absurd. Obviously, Europe's not going to disappear, and he won't be the last president to be in Europe. But the point of the title is really, after all the research and reporting I did, I concluded that Macron is really the only leader left in Europe now who remains faithful to the values and ideals of the founding fathers of the European Union. You know, after World War II, after the terrible tragedy, European leaders came together and created the European Coal and Steel Community, and then later on other institutions. There was a conviction then that they should make war impossible. After two costly world wars in the 20th century that devastated the European continent, they wanted to make that impossible. And it started with reconciliation between France and Germany. And I would say down through, right through Helmut Kohl in Germany and Francois Mitterrand, there was a succession of French and German leaders who believed strongly in Europe moving forward toward what an ultimate goal of maybe a United States of Europe. Jacques Delors used to say, Europe is like a bicycle. It has to keep moving forward or we will fall off. And somehow it seems the last few years, that view has been muffled somewhat, and Macron has tried to bring it back to life by speaking out on the importance of these values. And the reason he does, not just for nostalgia for the vision of these founding fathers, it's really that the problems, he says, of the 21st century surpass the ability of nation states to solve them. We need to collaborate on cross-border solutions, whether it's climate change, and now most vividly, we see with the COVID-19 virus pandemic, that when Europe's country and nation states scrambled to find their own solution, it led to chaos. And some predicted might even be the end of Europe. But Macron says this only proves his point that Europe needs to work together to find solutions to these problems.
Bill, have you heard from President Macron since the book was published?
I have. Just a couple of weeks ago, I received a very nice letter from him.
Good.
Saying, I appreciate very much your interest and your hard work. And this is a very impressive book.
Well, his review probably means more than mine, but I will agree with him. I echo his comments. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for writing it, and thanks for being our guest today. And let me remind everyone that you can pick up a copy of The Last President of Europe by going to interabangbooks.com or your independent bookstore in whatever city you live in. Hope you'll continue to support our World Affairs Council by supporting programs like this, as well as texting DFW to 44321. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.